It's Wednesday, October 6th, 2021, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the studio in the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Kathy Kiley and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, what caused Monday's worldwide outage on Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Oculus? And was it connected to the weekend's headlines about the company's business practices? We'll also talk about what Aussie Media's founder is calling the company's Lazarus moment, how the company collapsed on Friday and was apparently back on Monday. And the longest-running host on television announces he's stepping down. After 54 years at the anchor desk, Pat Robertson says he is retiring from the 700 Club. There's a lot more that we're going to hopefully get to before our time is up today, but we're going to go back and start with Facebook and the stories that broke this weekend in the New York Times and on 60 Minutes, the 6-hour outage that took down all of its platforms, including some of the internal communication tools used at that company. Here's a clip from Sunday's 60 Minutes in which the whistleblower, formerly known as Sean, said something, frankly, I think many of us already knew.
Facebook over and over again has shown it chooses profit over safety. It is subsidizing, it is paying for its profits with our safety. I'm hoping that this will have had a big enough impact on the world that they get the fortitude and the motivation to actually go put those regulations into place.
So this woman appeared before Congress yesterday. She testified before a Senate committee. She's urging lawmakers to just step in and regulate Facebook already. It's time, and what were they waiting for?
Well, Facebook has done something really miraculous. They have gotten bipartisan agreement in Congress. There were Democrats and Republicans at that hearing equally outraged by what's going on. And I think, it's almost like you wonder if you were really Machiavellian, was the outage a Facebook-initiated outage to say, think you can't live without us? See how it goes.
I got to tell you, though,
that's my Machiavellian.
I kind of have to say, though, and Ernest, I know you're not on Facebook, though I do know you use WhatsApp, right?
Yeah, I do.
I had potentially the most productive day on Monday that I've had in years. And when Facebook and when Messenger and when Instagram did come up, I was almost kind of disappointed. I felt like my bubble of quiet was gone.
Well, I mean, as both of you know, I'm not a huge
social media guy,
person. I understand its utility, and I do like WhatsApp because it does help and staying in touch with family, pretty much. But I'm with you. It was one of those things where I didn't hear a lot from people who I know are into social media about being totally disrupted. I mean, you still had the ability to send a text through the phone. So there was still that communication element through other ways and other channels. It's just that one was what was missing. Yeah. But I'm with you. When I heard about it after it came back up, I was like, the whistleblower goes on 60 Minutes on Sunday. Mm-hmm. The hearing is on Tuesday, and everything sort of comes to a screeching halt in the middle of that. As were they trying to send a message?
So the fact, though, that some of Facebook's internal communication mechanisms went down, do you still think it was internal because there was part of me that was wondering if this is like hackers from the outside.
I was being semi-facetious. Okay. I don't know why.
Yeah. And I don't know that any of us do or will.
But I do think that I think it demonstrates a couple of things. I think it does make an argument for regulation, because even though we're kind of sitting here and laughing, that it didn't really disrupt our lives, there are a lot of businesses, including community newspapers, that now rely on Facebook. If they can't afford a website or they don't have the broadband to operate a website, they use Facebook. There are even in this state counties and county health departments that are using Facebook as their primary means of communication. So I think where we are as a public policy question is this now so much a public utility that we can't rely on a private company, that the government needs to step in. That's one argument. The other argument is the argument that the whistleblower made, which is Facebook's drive for private profit is causing it to do things that it knows are unsafe. And this sounds a lot like the playbook of big tobacco and fossil fuels and all the kind of obfuscation you do to kind of don't look over here. And so I think that's where you see members of Congress really reacting.
Yeah, to me, I'm with you on that, and I know we're old enough to remember the AT&T, what we call AT&T now, when it used to be Ma Bell, and its control over the telephone, and the government finally had to step in and say, okay, you're too big of a monopoly. I mean, it goes back to Standard Oil, it goes back to all of those. We may be at that moment where there's a realization, especially in light of the fact that you have both political parties who are in agreement about the controlling nature of Facebook, and in particular they seem to be going after Mark Zuckerberg in particular in some ways. This could be that, okay, we need to regulate this to the point where we need to have competition in the market because you're monopolizing it to the point where you have way too much control.
Yeah, or the other way to regulate, and this is something that was brought up in a New York Times piece today, where a former Facebook data scientist, somebody who actually, he said he helped write some of the algorithms, is arguing, and I've said this before, and I know the internet evangelicals are going to throw big brickbats at me, but for revising Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which really gives internet platform providers, not just Facebook, but internet platform providers, a pass on libel. And he said, make them responsible for what they publish. In effect, say what they are, publishers, and make them responsible just as any publisher is. And boy, would that be full employment for our graduates.
Which is something that the EU is doing right now.
I also want to bring up what's going on in Australia too.
Right.
Where in Australia, and we've seen this with several media organizations and companies here. I know Sinclair is one of them that has gone in and told individual stations and told the employees in those stations who have personal pages associated with the organization to block audience in Australia, because if somebody likes or shares or comments in such a way that creates the vitriol or introduces misinformation or includes libel, that the organization that originally published the content to it would be legally responsible. And so companies here are now saying, we don't want anyone in Australia to see our work for just that reason.
And this is exactly, if you're a newspaper publisher and somebody puts slander in a letter to the editor or libel, you are liable for that.
That's right.
And so this is just applying those rules to internet platform providers, and I think that's where we're headed.
But I think it does get back to the point that the whistleblower was making when basically when she said, look, they're putting profit ahead of safety. They're putting profit ahead of the kind of disinformation, misinformation that leads to people believing that that the vaccine has a chip in it, that there was a massive fraud in the election, all of those kinds of things. And she just laid it out. I mean, I listened to the entire interview. She literally laid it out that, Facebook could have done something about that misinformation well before November, well before January 6th, and they chose not to. And they, even though they basically said, well, we're gonna keep this out of the public eye on Facebook until March, there were still ways that people were getting around that and making use of it.
And changing or coming up with coded language that algorithms weren't catching or whatever that might be. I also want to talk about what's been happening at Aussie Media this past week. And Ernest, one of the headlines that I saw about the story immediately made me think of you and the advice that you gave me before I went to go see Black Panther. It's from the Neiman Lab at Harvard University, and it says, "This is why you always wait for the post-credits scene referencing the Marvel movies,
That's right.
where there's always a little bit more to the story when you think that you've seen it all." Friday, Aussie Media, the company's management, said that it was calling it quits after a series of damaging reports that the company had falsified audience metrics. There were some stories revealing the company's chief operating officer impersonating a YouTube executive on a call with a potential investor from Goldman Sachs, and allegations that the workplace culture there was just absolutely toxic. Several members of the board stepped down. Well, over the weekend, CEO Carlos Watson met with advertising partners, readers, viewers, and investors, and apparently came to the conclusion the business is worth saving. Monday morning, he went on the Today Show and called this the company's Lazarus moment, and that it's time to pull Aussie Media up from the depths again. Craig Melvin was skeptical and asked some pretty tough questions.
Following the racial justice protests last summer, there was a call for advertisers to spend lots more money with black-owned media. You got some of that money, and over the weekend I talked to some folks who are pretty annoyed that you got millions and they really didn't get anything. Do you feel some sort of way that perhaps maybe you shouldn't have got as much money from advertisers?
Why would I feel that way?
Well, the business collapsed last week. Carlos,
the business is.
You've got 90. You raised almost $100 million, and what do you have to show for it?
What we have to show for it is 5 newsletters, a dozen TV shows, either on the air on Hulu, Amazon, PBS, BBC. We won an Emmy last year, as you know.
The 4-episode series on home.
6 podcasts, including Cracking the Top 10, and 3 festivals. You know, the
so it's not a house of cards, because that's been the claim over the last week.
And Craig, you among others know what a horrible thing that is, and you know how slanderous that is to do that. And when you saw people start to put my name in league with Elizabeth Holmes, who never had a real product, who raised billions of dollars, when again we have 5 premium newsletters, goes out to millions of people, a dozen TV shows, including winning an Emmy, right? That's not a house of cards. And so, look, we're back. It's not going to be easy, but I hope if people
who's backing you?
If people now know the name Aussie, O-Z-Y,
yeah.
I hope they'll sign up for our newsletter.
Of course.
Yeah.
Who's funding you right now? Can you tell us that?
I can't.
Who's on the board?
Myself, Michael Moe.
Okay, so that was a minute 38 of what was a 7.5-minute interview. I had a hard time trying to even narrow down which questions to bring up here. I really did feel like Craig Melvin was trying really hard to get some real answers about what happened there.
Yeah, he was definitely trying hard to get some answers from Carlos Watson. Here's the thing. There were, and we have I think it's on our Links blog, the piece that the New York Times did. They've done several, but one of them that I really liked that they did was where they talked about the investors and the fact that the investors themselves didn't do due diligence before they invested in this. And even once it was up and running, they sort of just said, hey, I'm giving the money, do what you want, that sort of thing, until things unraveled with the New York Times piece, and now all of a sudden they're all jumping ship. So they're just as culpable, I think, to a certain extent, as Carlos Watson and some of the other management.
One of those examples, and Kathy, we're going to talk about another New York Times piece that you brought to my attention late yesterday in a second. But one of the other things that was in that Today Show interview was specific about Sharon Osbourne, Ozzy Osbourne's wife, and the
he
fact
just
that
threw her under the bus.
Did he not? Okay, so to provide a little bit of context about this part of the conversation, if you haven't seen or heard it, Aussie Media has said that Sharon Osbourne is an investor in the company. So you talk about investors not doing their due diligence. She is an investor, according to Carlos Watson, because she and Ozzy Osbourne sued the company for using Ozzy Fest as a trademark violation for Ozfest, and for really using their name in so many ways or something very close to it. And the settlement was to give her stock in the company, and in doing so, they're calling her an investor. Is she?
Technically, she is, but I don't think she thinks she's an investor.
Yeah,
so.
most of us, I think, there's the technical, the legalistic version of the term, but to most of us, investor means I took some money and I bought shares. Yes, I invested
give
money.
it to me to get me to leave you alone. In all seriousness, though, Kathy, one of that the piece I'm talking about specifically that you had brought up is an opinion piece that was in the New York Times yesterday about the need to have greater funding and investment sources for Black-owned media, and for that to also be coming from other Black investors and other Black-owned investment companies.
Well, and I think you heard a little bit of that in the clip that we just played when Craig Melvin was asking questions about, don't you feel a little bit guilty about getting all this money and then folding? And I think the reason... Yeah, of course not. Well, okay, here's my take on that. My take is my investment was too big to fail. That's one of the investors saying, what? Oh, no, I'm not going to lose all that money. You better get back to work. Right. But I think to get back to the point of the New York Times op-ed, which I thought was really interesting, it's by a woman who, formerly an editor at Vox, who is starting up an organization to try to create a nonprofit a news organization to cover Black issues, news, people, etc. And her point, and I think this is exactly what Craig Melvin was saying, and I got a little bit from one of our guests yesterday, one of our Missouri honor medalists, Maria Hinojosa, who also runs a nonprofit aimed at the Latino audience, and saying, why don't we get some of that money? And the argument is, and the argument that was made at the Times, in the Times op-ed piece is, if you do hard-hitting stories, if you do stories about uncomfortable subjects, investors don't want to invest in you, advertisers don't want to advertise, and Aussie was much fluffier, much more Morning in America, and they got the money. But if you really want to do real journalism, it's a lot harder to raise the cash.
No, absolutely, and that's historically, and that's one of the things that nonprofit news organizations that really want to do that kind of work. That's one of the things that they've struggled with. Whether you're talking about being a minority focused nonprofit or being mainstream nonprofit. I mean, I just think about the early days of the Texas Tribune. They struggled early on to be able to do what they're doing now. They've been able to build a model that works, but they struggled as well for the same reason. But the reason Aussie was to me was able to do what it was doing was because it stuck to the cultural. It stuck to pop culture, it stuck to entertainment, it stuck to the sort of side issues and that sort of thing. Every now and then it would dip its toes into like Black Lives Matter or that sort of thing. But even when it did that, it did it on a surface level and not really deep into what the issues were. And the investors liked it because they saw it as something that, hey, I can say that I am supporting a minority-owned business. I'm supporting news and information that reaches a minority audience. Therefore, I'm doing something to help bring people together.
The big question, and that's what was raised in the New York Times piece, and even by Maria Hinojosa when she was here, is does that siphon dollars off of people who are doing real journalism, who really need the money to make it to where the Texas Tribune
But here's the argument I have that the people who made those investments weren't going to do that anyway.
They were in it to be able to say, look at me, I'm doing the right thing, even if it isn't with the right motivation.
Yes, what's the term? Virtue showing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Virtue signaling. Right
Thank
there.
you.
Yeah.
I knew I had the wrong word.
Absolutely. I mean, that I think that's one of the fallacies that we think is that, okay, if they would stop giving it to this person who's not really doing that, then they'll give it to me. No, they're not. They're not going to give it to you because that's not where they want to put their money.
Okay, so as we're also talking about nonprofits, I want to talk about a pretty big story that's going on right now in Chicago, where a year ago the Chicago Tribune was bought out by a big bad hedge fund, Alden Capital. Now the Sun-Times might too find itself under new ownership. Chicago Public Media, which is the parent company of one of the nation's public radio powerhouses, WBEZ Radio. So Kathy, this is actually a sale to get excited about.
It sure is. And I think we've seen smaller examples of this in St. Louis when the public radio station there acquired The Beacon, which was a nonprofit news organization. In Washington, D.C., similarly, the public radio station there acquired DCist, which was doing hyperlocal news. But this is really a big deal because this would be a major legacy newspaper that is effectively being thrown a lifeline by a nonprofit organization.
Which will also end up now creating one of the biggest and most powerful newsrooms in the city as well, surpassing the footprint from the Tribune.
No, I think that is a great point, Amy. I think because the Tribune has dominated Chicago media for so long, and this really flips the script. I mean, they are no longer, if this happens, they no longer will be the powerhouse media. And, the Chicago Sun-Times has always been the scrappy underdog. They have always worked their tails off. And so I think there's a history of good news coverage there. I think the interesting thing is it's going to totally change the personality of the paper. I mean, this is a paper that was always tabloidian, and especially under its more recent ownership,
But it's also blue collar.
Yes, and it's very much the working
and that's
person's
one of the things
paper
that, and I read this, I was thinking, well, wait a minute,
Yeah.
okay, you've got public radio, which is not necessarily seen as blue collar, buying a blue collar operation. Is there going to be some sort of cultural tension there between the two?
It might be healthy.
Organizations? It might be, but I was looking at it from that perspective, but I was also looking at it from, here's another opportunity to create a business model that might save or change. It's definitely going to change, but it might be a way to save a large metropolitan newspaper, and I think that's very important.
One of the things, too, about the Sun-Times that always stood out to me as a Chicagoan, as somebody who was a stringer for them, as someone who worked for the Tribune, the Sun-Times was always the commuter newspaper. And this is part of the blue-collar thing, but that's what you would see people reading on the L or on the Metro coming in from the suburbs. It's what you would see people reading on the bus. Radio is portable. So if you can also get them listening, especially in an environment where, yes, there's, the WBBM News Radio 24/7, but if you could also get the NPR style radio that's more news and information with talk that is not vitriolic, that is not argumentative, it really could bring in the highly engaged, highly educated blue collar worker into that public radio audience that might not otherwise be there.
And it might give the public radio station a new perspective on audience and how to build audience in places it doesn't have audience right now.
Absolutely.
So imagine spending 54 years in the same job. Friday, as the Christian Broadcasting Network staff celebrated the 60th anniversary of the 700 Club, Pat Robertson said goodbye.
After, I think, 54 years of hosting the program, I thank God for everyone that's been involved, and I want to thank all of you, but I want you to know that at this point I'm stepping down.
54 years at that anchor desk. It's quite a legacy. Some of it really good, some of it exceptionally controversial.
Yeah, I mean, when I read the story, I went like, "Wow, he was still on." I mean,
Well, yeah, there's that too.
That's
The
sort of
700 Club doesn't exactly
mean,
have a big footprint these days.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of lost, to be honest with you, I sort of lost track of it.
Yeah.
But I just remember that show being on initially, being on late at night or very early in the morning, which is the only time you could catch it before cable exploded, and then it was on all over the place. But I mean, yes, it was a lot of it was controversial. A lot of it was really experimental because he brought Christian television into a sort of news-like environment that in many ways was the precursor to what we see in right-wing radio right now, not necessarily Christian, but right-wing political operations that you see right now that proliferate on cable television and in other places. I mean, a lot of it was started in the 700
Yeah,
Club.
well, he really started something different, and I mean, he made Christianity a TV for TV,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But I think he also, I will say that one of Pat Robertson's last official acts was to tell Donald Trump, whom he had endorsed, to move on, and to call out the January 6th riots. Not all evangelicals did that.
Right.
So one other thing that was innovative, you talk about the groundbreaking work that he did there. The reason it's called the 700 Club, I didn't know this until yesterday, was because when he started it up 60 years ago, his goal was every week to have 700 people send in $10 per week to sustain the network.
Crowdfunding.
Exactly. Crowdfunding before its time. Also one of the very first examples of subscription television. Before we go, I heard this on Good Morning America earlier today, and I could not pass up the opportunity to make a late ad to our show's rundown because I wanted to hear Ernest and Kathy's take on it. You know this song?
The day's looking new and bright, and you're gonna start it right. The best part of waking up is Folgers in your cup.
So the rights to that jingle they were sold at auction a few days ago for more than $90,000, which means every time it plays, the bidder, a guy by the name of Josh C., is going to get a cut, and he will get the royalties to that jingle for life. It's a heck of a retirement plan right there.
Why did they do that?
Why did who do that? The people that auctioned it off? Yeah. Your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. I sort of feel about the Folgers jingle the way you did about Pat Robertson. I had totally lost track of that. In the whole Starbucks environment, is that how many times is it going to get played? I'm not sure that was a good investment.
Well, it took me 23 minutes to get my cup of coffee this morning, so I don't know about the Starbucks thing. But if you could pick one jingle that you could buy the rights to, that you can think of off the top of your head, what comes to mind?
It would be another one. It would be Maxwell House. I mean, that thing has been out forever.
The best part? No, that was Folgers.
That was Folgers. Oh, God.
Maxwell House, you're on the spot.
Good to the last drop.
Good, but is that a jingle?
It's not a
Did we
jingle, but
single
it is. But
it's like that trademark thing.
But it's a trademark and it's out there. If I could own that one, I think,
I can't think of one.
Okay, so let me tell you which ones they were talking about. Well, let me tell you what they were talking about on Good Morning America this morning, and maybe you'll have some thoughts. Chili's. You want your baby back ribs?
Yeah, okay, I don't know if I want that one.
Okay. You a candy fan? What about Kit Kat? Give me a break. Give me a break. You're looking at me like I'm nuts. Break me off a piece of that Kit Kat bar.
I think this is really interesting because I think it shows how, maybe because of social media, jingles aren't what they used to be. Where did you hear jingles? You heard them on the radio and you heard them on TV. And how many people are doing that anymore?
Well, I, for one, don't watch live TV because I fall asleep during the commercials and zip right through them on the DVR.
Well, there you go. Yeah. And so I don't know if those jingles are going to... I don't know.
Whether or not they survive.
Right.
I mean, that could be. But that's one of the things where I was talking about Maxwell House Coffee. I mean,
it's printed on the box.
It's printed in the box. They use it in there and on their website and that sort of thing. And I mean, that phrase and saying goes all the way back, I think, to the 1940s and 1950s. So.
If not before that, good to the last drop.
Budweiser.
Yeah.
Okay, our show, good to the last drop. We are out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. Read more about each of the topics we talked about today on our links blog under both the programs and podcast tabs at kbia.org. You can also catch the show again wherever you get your podcast downloads, including iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again. Leave comments and questions and see what we'll be talking about next week. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing the show, Aaron Hay for handling the audio, and Tim Pilcher for our original theme music.